My parents mocked my husband at Christmas dinner and said, "He's beneath us." I smiled and handed them a folder. They turned pale. I replied, "Your rich son-in-law is a fraud. Enjoy being broke." I am Riley. I am 32 years old, and as I stand here in the quiet solitude of my downtown apartment, holding a warm mug of dark roast coffee and watching a heavy December snowstorm blanket the bustling streets of Madison, Wisconsin, I finally feel an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. It is a heavy, hard-earned kind of peace. The specific kind of tranquility you only get to experience after walking barefoot through a Category 5 emotional hurricane and miraculously coming out the other side, still breathing. You see, I am completely and intentionally estranged from my entire family right now, and I chose to be. I made the conscious, deliberate choice to permanently sever the ties with the very people who were supposed to love and protect me the most in this world. To truly understand why I closed that heavy oak door on my own flesh and blood without shedding a single tear, you have to understand the terrifyingly perfect, suffocating little suburban dollhouse I was forced to grow up in. From the outside, my childhood home looked like something ripped straight out of the glossy pages of an expensive real estate magazine. It was a sprawling, immaculately manicured two-story estate located in a highly sought-after, ridiculously expensive neighborhood. The lawn was always a vibrant, chemically treated shade of green, even in the middle of a drought. The large front porch was always freshly painted, the massive white columns gleamed in the sunlight, and the wide driveway was constantly swept clean of even the smallest fallen leaves. But inside those pristine walls, the air was perpetually thick with unspoken rules, rigid judgments, and crushing, impossible expectations. My mother, Sylvia, was the ruthless architect and warden of this beautiful prison. She was a woman whose entire earthly existence revolved around neighborhood status, country club gossip, and maintaining the flawless illusion of absolute perfection. To Sylvia, a family was not a group of human beings who loved and supported each other unconditionally through flaws and mistakes. It was an ongoing, high-stakes public relations campaign that needed to be aggressively micromanaged 24 hours a day. My father, Gregory, was a senior corporate accountant at a massive firm downtown. You would logically think that a man who spent his entire adult life meticulously analyzing numbers, balancing ledgers, and actively searching for hidden discrepancies would eventually notice the massive, gaping emotional deficit occurring right inside his own living room. But he did not. Or rather, he actively chose not to see it. My father used total silence and his daily newspaper as an impenetrable shield against reality. He completely abandoned me to my mother's daily tyranny because simply nodding along, agreeing with whatever she said, and keeping his mouth shut was the absolute easiest way for him to maintain his own peace and quiet after a long day at the office. He was a passive, cowardly bystander in my life, which, in many deeply painful ways, hurt far more than my mother's direct, calculated control. The very first time I fully realized that my voice, my desires, and my happiness did not matter in that house, I was only 7 years old. I had come home from elementary school buzzing with pure, unadulterated childhood excitement, tightly clutching a brightly colored paper flyer for a local weekend youth soccer league. I desperately wanted to run outside, get my knees muddy, learn to be part of a team, and kick a ball around the grass with the other neighborhood kids. I ran straight into the pristine kitchen, my sneakers squeaking on the polished tiles, and excitedly slapped the crumpled paper onto the cold marble island right in front of my mother. She paused her vegetable chopping, barely glanced at the paper for a fraction of a second, and then casually swept it directly into the stainless steel trash can. She did not even look at my face. She simply told me, using that icy, terrifyingly matter-of-fact tone she always used to shut down arguments before they started, that sweaty, dirty girls do not grow up to get good, wealthy husbands. Instead of buying me cleats, she immediately enrolled me in expensive classical piano lessons with a strict instructor across town. I absolutely hated the piano with every fiber of my being. I had no natural rhythm. My hands were far too small to reach the complex chords properly, and the pressure gave me terrible stomach aches. But for the next 5 long years, I was forced to sit on that hard, unforgiving wooden bench for 2 agonizing hours every single afternoon. I practiced until my fingers physically cramped and my lower back throbbed with pain. My mother would stand directly behind me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, tapping her leather shoe on the hardwood floor in time with the metronome, sighing heavily and loudly every single time I missed a minor note. She never once praised me for finishing a difficult, 10-page piece. She only asked why my posture was slouching or why I could not play it perfectly on the very first attempt. I learned very early on that in Sylvia's house, genuine effort meant absolutely nothing. You were only valued for the flawless, shiny results you could produce for her to brag about to her wealthy friends over brunch. And unfortunately for me, flawless was a standard I could never quite reach, no matter how hard I tried to bend myself into the shape she wanted. The main reason I could never reach that impossible standard of perfection was simply because the position had already been securely filled long before I was even old enough to understand the competition. Enter my older sister, Monica. If I was the disappointing, messy rough draft that needed constant erasing and correcting, Monica was the glowing, final masterpiece ready for the museum display. She was the golden child in every conceivable sense of the word. Naturally charismatic, effortlessly beautiful, and terrifyingly, brilliantly manipulative. She knew exactly what to say, how to smile, and exactly how to play my parents' insecurities like a finely tuned instrument. She was my mother's ultimate trophy, the living, breathing proof that Sylvia was a superior mother to all the other women at the country club. I remember one highly specific evening during my second year of middle school that perfectly and tragically highlighted the core dynamic of our toxic household. I had spent 3 entire, grueling weeks studying for a massive advanced math midterm. Math did not come naturally to me at all. It felt like trying to read a foreign language backward. So, I stayed up late every single night, made hundreds of color-coded flashcards, did endless practice problems until my vision blurred, and pushed myself to the absolute mental limit. When the teacher finally handed my test back to me, I looked at the red ink and saw a B+ circled at the top. I was so incredibly proud of myself. The relief washed over me in waves. I practically ran the whole way home from the bus stop, desperately excited to show my parents at dinner and finally earn a moment of their pride. When we all sat down at the long dining table that evening, I eagerly reached into my backpack and pulled the slightly crumpled test paper out. Before I could even speak a single word or announce my grade, Monica casually, almost lazily, tossed her own quarterly report card directly onto the center of the table right next to the salad bowl. Straight A's, as always. A perfect 4.0 GPA. She had bragged all semester that she had barely opened a textbook and spent most of her study hall periods gossiping. My mother let out a loud, theatrical gasp of sheer delight, immediately pushed her chair back, picked up Monica's report card like it was a sacred artifact, and marched straight to the kitchen to pin it to the center of the stainless steel refrigerator with a special decorative gold magnet. She hugged Monica tightly and promised to take her shopping for expensive new clothes at the high-end mall that upcoming weekend as a grand reward. I sat back down, quietly slid my hard-earned B+ test across the table toward my mother's empty plate, hoping against hope for just a crumb of that same affection. When Sylvia finally returned to the table, she glanced down at my paper, frowned slightly as if looking at a bad stain, and sighed a long, exhausted sigh. She looked me dead in the eye and asked, her voice dripping with genuine annoyance, "Why can't you just apply yourself and be more like your sister?" I did not say a word. I quietly folded the paper in half, put it deep into my pocket, and ate my dinner in complete, crushing silence. The emotional neglect and the blatant favoritism were bad enough, but the active, malicious sabotage from my sister was significantly worse. Monica loved to constantly remind me of my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. When I was 13 years old, I spent a whole month working every evening in the garage building a highly complex, detailed diorama of a volcanic ecosystem for the regional science fair. I painted every tiny foam tree, mixed the plaster, and carefully assembled the structure. It was the best thing I had ever made. The night before the big competition, I left it sitting safely in the center of the kitchen table so the final layer of glue could dry overnight. The next morning, I woke up early, excited to pack it into the car. I walked into the kitchen and found my project completely smashed to pieces, scattered across the hardwood floor. Monica was standing there in her silk pajamas, holding a glass of water. She claimed, with a perfectly practiced look of fake innocence, that she had accidentally bumped into the table while getting a drink in the dark. But the heavy wooden base of the diorama was completely cracked in half, far beyond a simple accidental bump. It looked like it had been forcefully thrown. I dropped to my knees, sobbing uncontrollably on the kitchen floor, trying desperately to gather the broken pieces. My father walked in, wearing his tailored work suit, holding his briefcase. He saw the massive mess, saw me crying, and saw Monica standing there with a tiny, victorious smirk hidden behind her water glass. I looked up at my father, my eyes red and puffy, pleading silently for him to defend me, to discipline her, to acknowledge the cruelty. Instead, he just sighed heavily, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and told me to just let it go and not upset my mother before she woke up. He told me to sweep up the mess immediately so the floor would not be ruined. In that exact moment, staring down at the ruined, shattered pieces of my month of hard work, I realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that I had no protectors in that house. I was entirely on my own, surviving in hostile territory. Entering high school did not bring the sudden rush of independence and freedom that most normal teenagers get to experience. If anything, my mother's iron grip on my daily life tightened into an absolute, suffocating chokehold. My teenage years were entirely defined by her absolute, relentless control over every single variable she could get her hands on. Sylvia dictated everything. She had to personally approve of every single piece of clothing I wore to school, ensuring my outfits were always perfectly modest, distinctly preppy, and conspicuously brand name. Nothing too flashy, but absolutely nothing cheap. She actively policed my daily diet, sitting across from me at the dinner table and casually mentioning that a second helping of baked pasta would inevitably make my face look round and ruin my complexion for the holiday photos. But without a doubt, the most damaging and isolating control she exercised was over my social life. My mother acted as a ruthless, highly prejudiced bouncer to my friendships. If a classmate did not come from the right prominent family, did not live in the correct wealthy zip code, or did not have parents in the country club, they were simply not allowed through our front door. During my sophomore year, I finally met a girl who lived a few streets over, right on the boundary of our neighborhood. Her name was Cassidy. We instantly bonded over a deeply shared, nerdy love of vintage comic books and classic 70s rock music. For a few glorious weeks, we spent our sunny afternoons sitting on her worn-down front porch, reading comics and laughing until our stomachs physically hurt. It was the most normal, most human I had felt in years. But the moment my mother did her usual background investigation and found out that Cassidy's father was a blue-collar construction worker and her mother worked the checkout line at a local grocery store, the friendship was immediately terminated. Sylvia banned me from ever seeing her again. She stood in the hallway, adjusting her pearl earrings, and told me that those kinds of people were inherently bad influences, that they lacked ambition, and that hanging around them would inevitably drag down my social standing and ruin my chances of getting into a good college. I was absolutely furious, a hot rage burning in my chest, but arguing with Sylvia was exactly like screaming at a reinforced brick wall. It only left you exhausted and bruised. So, I learned the fine art of hiding. I became a master at living a secret double life under her own roof. I hid the vintage comic books flat underneath my mattress. I talked to my friend late at night using a cheap burner phone I bought with money I had secretly saved from babysitting the neighbors' kids. I learned how to nod, how to smile politely, and how to say exactly what my mother wanted to hear to avoid a lecture, all while secretly building a thick, impenetrable emotional wall around my true self. It was deeply exhausting, constantly monitoring every word and facial expression, but it was the only way I could survive in that house without losing my mind completely. By the middle of my junior year, I realized with absolute certainty that I needed a permanent escape plan. I knew deep in my bones that if I stayed in Madison living under their roof or relying on their money, I would eventually suffocate entirely. My spirit would be completely broken. The only viable ticket out was college. Naturally, my mother already had my entire future completely mapped out on a spreadsheet. She aggressively demanded that I study nursing or education, two professions she deemed highly respectable, safe, and perfectly appropriate for a future suburban wife to fall back on. But I had a secret, burning passion for business, strategy, and creative design. I quietly and secretly applied to the University of Wisconsin for a highly competitive degree in marketing. For 3 agonizing months, I rushed home from school to intercept the mail carrier every single day, absolutely terrified that my mother would find a letter from the business school. When the thick, heavy envelope finally arrived confirming my official acceptance into the marketing program, I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom, sat down on the cold tile floor, and cried heavy tears of pure, unadulterated relief. It was my very first act of true, undeniable rebellion against her empire. When I finally gathered the courage to break the news to my parents at dinner, Sylvia threw a massive, screaming fit, slamming her hand on the table and calling marketing a fake, useless degree for lazy people who just want to draw pictures all day. My father, predictably, stayed completely silent, staring down at his plate. But I stood my ground. My hands were shaking, but I held the acceptance letter tightly. For the first time in 18 years, I saw the heavy, locked door to my golden cage finally crack open just a tiny bit, and I knew I was going to run through it. Moving out of that pristine suburban mansion and into a cramped, noisy, poorly ventilated college dorm room was the greatest, most profound luxury I had ever experienced in my entire life. The twin bed was rock hard. The hallway always smelled faintly of cheap bleach and burnt instant ramen, and the radiator clinked loudly all night, but the air inside that tiny room felt entirely different. It felt like breathing pure, exhilarating freedom. For the first time in 18 years, I could choose exactly what I wanted to eat without commentary. I could make my own erratic schedule, stay up until 3 in the morning reading strategy textbooks, and walk out the front door into the brisk campus air without being interrogated about my destination, my companions, or my outfit. I threw myself headfirst into my marketing classes, finding a deep, burning passion for brand strategy, consumer psychology, and creative storytelling. I was finally building a brain and a life that belonged entirely to me. However, escaping the physical boundaries of the house did not mean I had successfully severed the psychological umbilical cord. Sylvia made absolutely sure of that. She called me strictly once a week, not to gently ask about my difficult classes, my mental well-being, or my new friends. Instead, her calls were tactical strikes designed to demand my mandatory attendance at various family photo shoots, holiday dinners, and tedious country club brunches. She desperately needed me to show up, wear the pastel dresses she bought for me, and play the role of the dutiful, happy, well-adjusted daughter to keep up the perfect appearances for her wealthy social circle. If I ever tried to stand my ground and say I was simply too busy studying for massive midterms or working on a group project, the resulting guilt trips were swift and brutally effective. She would dramatically accuse me of tearing the family apart, crying loudly into the phone receiver, playing the victim until the exhaustion wore me down and I finally caved, bought a bus ticket, and traveled back home just to stop the relentless harassment. I was physically living out of the house, but I was still paying heavy rent in emotional currency every single week. The stark, undeniable reality of my family's true priorities hit me the absolute hardest on the day of my college graduation. I had worked 3 exhausting part-time jobs, waitressing at a diner, shelving books at the campus library, and tutoring freshmen, just to help cover the tuition costs they stubbornly refused to pay in full because I had defied their major choice. Against all the odds and exhaustion, I was graduating with high honors in the business school. I was so incredibly proud of my resilience. I stood out there on the massive campus lawn in the sweltering, humid summer heat, wearing my heavy black cap and gown, anxiously scanning the massive crowd of cheering families, searching for my parents. They showed up 25 minutes late, missing my name being called entirely. When I finally found them, Sylvia spent the entire remainder of the outdoor ceremony loudly complaining to anyone who would listen about the uncomfortable plastic folding chairs, the terrible parking situation, and the absolute lack of shade. When we finally left the campus and went out to a very nice, expensive downtown restaurant to supposedly celebrate my hard-earned degree, the conversation about my achievements lasted exactly 5 minutes before Sylvia completely and expertly hijacked it. Monica had just received her official acceptance letter into a highly prestigious, notoriously cutthroat corporate law firm in Chicago. The entire dynamic of the dinner instantly shifted away from my graduation. For the next 2 hours, the only topics of conversation were Monica's massive new starting salary, her upcoming corner office with a view of the skyline, and the elite, high-profile clients she would soon be aggressively representing. My father, beaming with pride, flagged down the waiter, ordered a $200 bottle of imported champagne, and raised his glass to passionately toast Monica's brilliant legal mind and bright future. I sat there in complete silence, tightly clutching my newly printed, expensive university degree under the table so it wouldn't get wrinkled, eating my steak while feeling completely and utterly invisible. It was a crushing, sobering realization that no matter what massive milestones I achieved, no matter how hard I worked to build my own successful life, it would never, ever be enough to earn a single drop of their genuine respect. Between the exhausting ages of 22 and 28, I took all of that leftover, burning frustration, bottled it up, and poured it directly into my professional career. I made a silent vow to myself: if my own family was never going to validate my worth or acknowledge my hard work, I was going to forcefully make the corporate world do it instead. After graduation, I landed a junior copywriting role at a fierce, high-pressure advertising agency right in the heart of downtown Madison. The environment was ruthless, but I thrived in the chaos. I worked grueling late nights fueled by terrible office coffee, gave up my weekends, and volunteered to work through major holidays just to get ahead. I constantly pitched bold, unconventional ideas in meetings, took massive creative risks that terrified the older executives, and slowly, methodically climbed the corporate ladder. By the time I turned 28, I had completely bypassed several older colleagues and was officially promoted to Associate Creative Director. I finally had my own corner office with a glass door, a 6-figure salary that provided total financial independence, and a dedicated team of talented designers reporting directly to me. I had built an empire of my own. I clearly remember the exact afternoon the massive promotion became officially finalized in writing. The managing partner of the agency shook my hand, smiled warmly, and handed me the thick new contract. I was practically vibrating with adrenaline and pride. Despite everything I knew, despite years of therapy and painful lessons, that small, deeply broken inner child buried inside me still desperately wanted her parents to be proud of her. I stepped out into the quiet hallway, leaned against the wall, took a deep breath, and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the second ring. I quickly blurted out the incredible news, excitedly telling her about the prestigious new title change, the massive bump in my salary, and the major national campaigns I would now be leading. I paused, holding my breath, desperately waiting for a simple "congratulations" or just one "I'm proud of you." Instead, right in the middle of my sentence, she suddenly let out a loud, ear-piercing, high-pitched scream of pure joy. I stopped talking immediately, confused. Through the phone receiver, I heard her yell away from the mouthpiece, "Oh my goodness, Monica. It finally arrived. Bring it here." My mother then casually put the phone back to her ear and spoke to me as if I had just told her what I had for lunch. "Sorry about that, Riley. Monica just unboxed that incredibly rare, limited edition designer leather handbag she's been sitting on the exclusive waitlist for since last year. The craftsmanship is absolutely stunning. You wouldn't believe the stitching. Anyway, what were you saying about your little work thing?" I felt my heart turn to absolute stone in my chest. I told her in a flat, dead voice that it was nothing important at all, quietly hung up the phone, walked slowly back into my beautiful new corner office, shut the heavy glass door, sat down in my leather chair, and cried until my eyes were swollen. That was the absolute last time I ever tried to share any piece of my professional success or personal joy with them. I finally, fully accepted the permanent emotional disconnect. I decided right then and there to just live my life entirely for myself and stop begging for water from an empty well. And then, just a few months later, right before my 29th birthday, the universe shifted on its axis. It was late afternoon, and it was pouring rain, a terrible, blinding, violent Midwestern thunderstorm that turned the sky completely black. I was frantically driving my beat-up, extremely unreliable old sedan to the most important, high-stakes client advertising pitch of the entire year. I was already highly stressed, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, when my car engine suddenly made a horrifying, loud grinding noise, shuddered violently, and completely died right in the middle of a desolate, flooded stretch of road on the industrial edge of town. I managed to coast over to the muddy shoulder, completely panicked. I frantically called a local towing company, practically begging the dispatcher to hurry because my entire career trajectory depended on making this meeting. 20 agonizing, terrifying minutes later, a heavy-duty yellow tow truck pulled up closely behind my dead car, its bright emergency lights cutting through the heavy sheets of freezing rain. And out of that truck stepped the man who would completely change the entire trajectory of my life forever. His name was Mason. He hopped down out of the massive cab of the tow truck wearing a thick, heavy, rain-soaked canvas jacket and scuffed steel-toed work boots. His large hands were permanently stained with dark engine grease, and he had a remarkably calm, unbothered expression on his handsome face that somehow instantly lowered my racing heart rate the second I looked at him. I jumped out of my dead car, popping open a flimsy umbrella, and began frantically explaining at 1,000,000 miles an hour that I had a massive, career-defining advertising pitch in exactly 45 minutes, and if I did not make it to the boardroom, my agency would lose a multi-million-dollar account, and it would be entirely my fault. Most mechanics working in a freezing downpour would have just coldly hooked the car up to the winch, handed me a clipboard to sign, and told me to call an expensive cab. But Mason did not do that. He looked closely at my panicked, tear-streaked face, gave a single, solid nod, and said in a deep, incredibly steady voice, "Let me see what I can do to get you there." He popped the hood of my sedan, completely ignoring the freezing rain pouring down his neck, and spent 5 intense minutes rapidly moving components around the engine bay. He managed to do a brilliant, temporary bypass fix on a completely blown fuse and a loose alternator wire using nothing but a pair of pliers and electrical tape. He slammed the heavy hood shut, wiped his greasy hands on a red shop rag, and told me the car would run just long enough to get me to my downtown meeting and then back to his repair shop afterward. He absolutely refused to take a single dollar of my money right then. He just handed me a slightly damp business card with the address to his garage, gave me a warm, reassuring smile, and told me to drive safe. I made the pitch with 5 minutes to spare. We won the massive account. And that very same evening, I slowly drove my sputtering, dying car directly into his brightly lit garage bay. That was the official beginning of our story. We started grabbing quick coffees during his lunch breaks, which slowly turned into long, easy dinners at a local diner. I learned that Mason was a master lead mechanic who had built his stellar reputation from the ground up through sheer hard work and honesty. He worked with his hands, he was brutally, refreshingly honest, and he had a deep, quiet, unbreakable pride in making a genuine, honest living. The stark contrast between Mason and my family was absolutely blinding. In my family's world, every single interaction was a calculated transaction. You had to perform constantly, achieve constantly, and look perfect constantly just to earn a tiny sliver of conditional affection. But Mason just listened. He actually listened to the words I was saying. He remembered exactly how I took my coffee after only one date black, with exactly one sugar packet. He asked genuine, thoughtful questions about the complexities of my advertising campaigns, and actually cared about the detailed answers I gave him. For the first time in 29 years of existence, I did not have to pretend to be someone else. I did not have to wear expensive, uncomfortable clothes or use big, pretentious words just to impress him. One incredibly stressful night, after I had a minor emotional breakdown in his living room about a highly toxic client project, he didn't offer unsolicited advice or tell me to toughen up. He just pulled me into a tight, warm hug, rested his chin on my head, and said the words that healed a massive part of my soul. "You don't ever need to earn your spot here, Riley. You are enough exactly as you are." I fell madly, deeply, irreversibly in love with him. But precisely because I loved him so much, I made the conscious decision to keep him a total secret from my family for over a full year. I was absolutely terrified of letting their toxic judgment, their snobbery, and their cruelty infect the only truly safe space I had ever known. I knew exactly how Sylvia and Monica would react to a man who proudly wore steel-toed boots to work and got dirt permanently lodged under his fingernails. Before we get into the absolute trainwreck disaster of finally introducing Mason to my highly judgmental family, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying the story so far. Also, please leave a comment down below with the name of the city you are living in right now. Every single comment helps the video reach more people, and I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much. Now, back to the story. When I finally turned 31, I came to the realization that I simply could not hide Mason in the shadows anymore. Our relationship was deeply serious. We were openly talking about buying a house, building a future together, and hiding him felt like a massive insult to the incredible, honorable man he was. So, going entirely against my screaming, highly anxious better judgment, I officially RSVP'd for 2 people for the annual, highly formal family Thanksgiving dinner. I spent 3 entire weeks prepping Mason for the event like a soldier going into battle. I warned him extensively about my mother's aggressive snobbery, my father's cowardly silence, and my sister's vicious, subtle cruelty. He just smiled his easy smile, kissed my forehead, and told me not to worry, that we would handle whatever they threw at us together as a united team. Walking through the heavy front doors of that pristine house with him felt exactly like stepping onto an active battlefield holding a lit match. The massive formal dining room was perfectly set with fine bone china, crystal wine glasses, and an overwhelming, suffocating amount of unspoken tension. It was there, standing in the foyer, that I was first introduced to Julian, Monica's brand new, highly anticipated fiancé. Julian was exactly, down to the microscopic details, the kind of man my mother dreamed of at night. He drove a leased, jet black Porsche, wore a heavy gold Rolex that he constantly made sure was visible, and could not stop talking loudly and aggressively about crypto investments, corporate synergies, and his elite, highly exclusive boutique investment firm. He was slick, heavily drenched in expensive cologne, and his overly confident demeanor immediately rubbed me the wrong way. Sylvia, of course, was practically drooling over him, hanging onto his every word as if he were a prophet. The deliberate humiliation of Mason started long before the massive turkey was even carved. During the cocktail and appetizer hour in the living room, my mother looked Mason up and down, her eyes slowly taking in his neat, clean, but simple button-down shirt and dark jeans. In front of the entire room, making sure her voice carried over the soft jazz music playing in the background, she asked him, "So Mason, tell me, are you planning to go back to school to get a real degree and a real job anytime soon? Being a mechanic is a fine little hobby for a teenager, but a grown man really needs to be able to provide a certain lifestyle." I felt the blood boil in my veins, a hot flash of pure rage hitting my chest. I immediately opened my mouth to snap back and defend him, but Mason gently reached over and squeezed my knee firmly. He smiled politely, not taking the bait, and replied calmly that he deeply loved his career, enjoyed working with his hands, and made a very comfortable, honest living running his own busy shop. Julian chuckled loudly, swirling his expensive red wine in his crystal glass, and added with a sickeningly arrogant smirk, "Hey, let the guy be, Sylvia. Someone has to change the dirty oil in our luxury cars, right?" Monica giggled, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. But the absolute lowest, most degrading point of the entire evening happened right after the main course, just before dessert was served. My mother casually complained that the complicated plumbing pipe under the massive kitchen sink had been slowly leaking water all morning. She stood up, walked to the utility drawer, pulled out a heavy metal wrench, walked back, and handed it directly to Mason. She looked at him and asked, in a tone that sounded more like a command to a servant, if he could crawl under the wet sink and fix it real quick before she served the pumpkin pie. She completely and utterly treated my partner, an invited guest in her home, like unpaid hired help. Mason, being the fiercely polite, deeply honorable man he is, actually got up from the formal table, took off his nice jacket, rolled up his sleeves, crawled under the sink, and fixed the pipe in exactly 10 minutes. While he was under there working, I sat frozen at the dining table, physically shaking with a rage so intense it made my vision blur. I sat there and watched Julian loudly brag about a new, multi-million-dollar summer house he was planning on buying for Monica in Aspen, while my father nodded in deep, reverent respect. It was the starkest, most agonizingly painful realization of my entire life. My family literally worshipped a loud, flashy, arrogant man in a tailored suit, but treated a kind, hardworking, deeply honest man like absolute dirt on their expensive shoes. That horrific Thanksgiving dinner officially set the stage, loaded the gunpowder, and lit the fuse for the massive explosion that would alter all of our lives forever. The aftermath of that Thanksgiving dinner was even worse than the dinner itself. After dessert was finally cleared, my father, Gregory, pulled me aside into his home office. I thought, for a fleeting, foolish second, that he was going to apologize for how my mother had treated Mason. Instead, he closed the heavy oak door, poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, and looked at me with deep disappointment. He told me that I was embarrassing my mother. He said that Julian was a real provider, a man of substance who understood the way the world worked. He called Mason a grease monkey and explicitly told me not to settle just to rebel against the family. I felt something inside me snap. Years of pent-up frustration, years of watching him hide behind his newspaper while my mother tore me down, finally boiled over. I exploded at him. I called out his decades of absolute cowardice. I told him that Mason had more integrity in his little finger than Julian had in his entire leased Porsche. My voice was loud enough that it echoed down the hallway. The office door swung open, and Sylvia marched in, her face twisted in absolute fury. She did not yell. She used that terrifying, quiet voice that meant there was no room for negotiation. She looked at me as if I were a piece of trash that had blown onto her perfectly manicured lawn. She delivered her final ultimatum. She said, "You are making a mockery of this family. Dump the mechanic, or do not bother coming to our Christmas party this year. Choose right now. Us or him." I did not even have to think about it. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless, and I said, "I choose him." I walked out of the office, grabbed my coat, and took Mason by the hand. We walked out the front door, leaving my half-finished slice of pie on the table. In the car ride home, Mason did not complain about the abuse. He did not ask me to explain my parents. He just kept one hand on the steering wheel, reached over with the other to hold my hand, and asked if I was okay. A month later, right in the middle of a freezing December, Mason and I made a decision. We did not want a big wedding. We did not want a massive spectacle filled with people who were secretly judging us. We went down to the local county courthouse on a Tuesday morning. It was just the two of us and a bored-looking judge. I wore a simple white dress I bought off the rack, and Mason wore his best suit. We exchanged rings that we bought with our own hard-earned money. It was quiet, it was intimate, and it was absolutely perfect. It was a pure, untainted moment of joy that belonged entirely to us. No seating charts, no country club gossip, no screaming mothers. Just a promise between two people who actually loved each other. We were officially husband and wife, and I had never felt more secure in my entire life. When I went back to the advertising agency after our secret wedding, I threw myself into a massive new project. Our firm had just landed a highly lucrative contract to completely rebrand an emerging local investment firm. The client was willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on new billboards, targeted digital ads, and a complete website overhaul. When the account manager dropped the client file on my desk, my blood ran cold. The company was owned by Julian. It was his boutique investment fund. As the lead marketing strategist for the agency, it was my job to do a deep dive into the client's business model. In the advertising world, before you run massive campaigns promising high-yield financial returns, you have to do strict due diligence to ensure advertising compliance. We cannot legally run ads for a company that cannot prove their claims. So, I sat at my desk, locked my door, and started digging into Julian's corporate structure. It did not take long for the shiny facade to completely crumble. The deeper I dug, the more horrified I became. The executive board members listed on his website? I ran reverse image searches on them. They were AI-generated faces and stolen stock photos. The massive, impressive corporate headquarters he boasted about at Thanksgiving? I looked up the physical address in the county property records. It was not a high-rise building. It was a tiny, anonymous post office box located inside a run-down strip mall on the edge of town. But the most damning evidence was the financial structure itself. I pulled the public filings and the limited liability company registrations. The money was not being invested into diverse portfolios or real estate like Julian claimed. The capital from new investors was being directly funneled to pay off the early investors to create the illusion of massive, rapid returns. It was a textbook, undeniable Ponzi scheme. Julian was not a financial genius. He was a con artist running a massive house of cards, and it was only a matter of time before the entire thing collapsed. I sat back in my desk chair, my heart pounding in my chest. I printed out every single piece of evidence. I printed the fake IP addresses, the stock photo receipts, the post office box registration, and the offshore transfer logs. I neatly compiled all of the papers and slid them into a thick, heavy manila folder. My initial thought was to march straight to my boss, present the folder, and kill the contract immediately to protect our agency. But then, the personal reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. Monica had bragged that she had invested her entire life savings into Julian's fund. My parents had likely given him their money, too. I held their complete financial ruin in my hands. Despite everything they had done to me, I hesitated. I realized that if I exposed him, I would be the one blowing up my sister's life. I assumed they would not believe me anyway, that they would just accuse me of being jealous of Monica's wealthy fiancé. So, I made a choice. I locked the thick manila folder in the bottom drawer of my desk. I decided to stay silent, quietly recuse myself from the ad campaign, and let them live in their delusion. By the time Christmas Eve rolled around, the tension in my chest was unbearable. Despite my mother's harsh ultimatum back at Thanksgiving, I made a decision. I was going to attend the massive family Christmas Eve party. My goal was simple. I was going to walk in with Mason, look them in the eye, announce that we were legally married, set a permanent, hard boundary, and leave. It was my final attempt to show them that they could not control me anymore. I wanted them to know that I had chosen my own path, and if they could not accept my husband, they would lose me forever. Before we left for the party, I opened my desk drawer. I looked at the thick manila folder containing the absolute proof of Julian's massive fraud. A gut instinct told me not to leave it behind. I did not plan on using it, but I knew my family. I knew Julian's arrogance. I wanted it as an insurance policy just in case he tried to pitch his scam to my extended family or the neighbors. I folded it slightly and slipped it deep into my oversized leather tote bag. We drove through the snow-covered streets of the suburbs and pulled up to my childhood home. It looked like a movie set. Every window was glowing with warm light, massive wreaths hung on the doors, and expensive cars lined the entire block. The house was absolutely packed with extended family, wealthy neighbors, and my parents' country club friends. The air smelled heavily of fresh pine needles, roasted meat, and expensive perfume. The moment Mason and I walked through the front doors, the atmosphere shifted. The lively chatter near the entrance died down into hushed, frantic whispers. I could feel dozens of eyes burning into the back of my neck. Across the massive living room, I spotted Sylvia. She was standing by the fireplace, holding a crystal glass of champagne, loudly parading Julian and Monica around to a group of wealthy relatives. Julian was wearing a tailored velvet blazer, looking incredibly smug as he handed out his business cards. Sylvia's eyes locked onto me, and then immediately darted to Mason standing by my side. Her smile vanished instantly. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She whispered something to my father, who immediately looked at the floor, avoiding my gaze entirely. I took a deep breath, squeezed Mason's hand to steady my racing heart, and walked directly toward the center of the room. The music seemed to fade away as everyone turned to watch the inevitable collision. I was stepping right into the lion's den, but for the first time in my 32 years of life, I was not afraid of the teeth. I stopped right in the middle of the living room, near the towering Christmas tree. I picked up a silver spoon from an appetizer tray and gently clinked it against a glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the remaining chatter. The entire party fell completely silent. 50 guests turned their heads to stare at me. I stood tall, kept my chin up, and looked directly at my mother. "I have an announcement," I said, my voice remarkably steady. I stepped closer to Mason and lifted my left hand, holding it up so the simple gold wedding band caught the light of the chandelier. Mason and I were married last week at the courthouse. We are officially husband and wife. For 5 agonizing seconds, there was a dead, suffocating silence. Nobody breathed. Then, the explosion happened. My mother's face turned a violent shade of purple. Her hand shook so badly that her champagne spilled over the edge of her crystal glass and dripped onto the expensive rug. She did not care about the guests. She did not care about her image. In front of 50 of her closest friends and family members, she screamed the words that shattered the last remaining pieces of my childhood. "You are no longer our daughter," Sylvia hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You are a disgrace to this family. In our eyes, you are already dead." My father, Gregory, stood right next to her. He did not defend me. He did not try to calm her down. He just looked at me with cold eyes and nodded his head in agreement. Across the room, Monica let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She took a slow sip of her drink and looked at me with absolute pity. But it was Julian who took it a step further. He stepped away from the fireplace, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He looked Mason up and down, making sure everyone in the room could hear him. "A secret wedding?" Julian mocked, his voice booming. "What? The grease monkey couldn't afford a real ring. Did you buy that out of a vending machine? He is totally beneath this family, Riley. He is a peasant. He will never be able to provide for you like I provide for Monica. Hell, I just bought us a summer house in Aspen with cash. Your husband probably has to finance his groceries." The relatives gasped. A few of the neighbors whispered and shook their heads. They expected me to break down. They expected me to burst into tears, drop Mason's hand, and run out the front door in total humiliation, just like I had done so many times when I was a teenager. They wanted me to be the broken, pathetic scapegoat they had always designed me to be. But I did not cry. My eyes did not even water. Standing there in the middle of that beautifully decorated living room, listening to the man who was actively robbing my family call my honest husband a peasant, the last 20 years of trauma completely vanished. The fear, the desperate need for their approval, the lingering guilt, it all evaporated, replaced by an absolute, terrifyingly icy clarity. I let out a soft, cold smile. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag. My fingers brushed against the thick manila envelope. I pulled it out, holding it up for a brief second. I took 3 steps forward until I was standing directly in front of the grand dining table, right between Julian and my sister. With a swift, forceful motion, I slammed the heavy folder down onto the polished wood. The impact was so loud it made several people jump, knocking over Julian's half-empty champagne glass. The golden liquid spilled across the table, soaking into a fancy napkin. I looked directly into Monica's eyes, then shifted my gaze to Julian. Your rich fiancé is a massive fraud, Monica, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the silent room. Julian's arrogant smirk instantly vanished. His face turned a sickly, ghost-white color. He panicked. He lunged forward, his hands reaching out to grab the folder off the table. But before his fingers could even brush the paper, Mason moved. With the terrifyingly quick reflexes of a man who works around heavy machinery, Mason stepped in front of me and clamped his large, grease-calloused hand down hard on Julian's shoulder. Mason did not say a word, but his grip was like an iron vise. Julian froze, his eyes wide with sudden, genuine fear. I opened the folder and spread the documents out across the wet table. I am the lead marketing strategist who was hired to audit his firm, I announced to the entire room. I pointed to the papers. This is the proof. His executive board is made of stolen stock photos. His massive corporate headquarters is a rented post office box in a strip mall. And the high-yield returns he is promising all of you? It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. He is taking new investor money to pay off the old ones. I looked back at my mother, who was staring at the documents in absolute horror, her mouth hanging open. Then I looked at Monica, whose hands were suddenly shaking uncontrollably. Everything he owns is a total scam, I said, pronouncing every single syllable with lethal precision. He does not own a summer house in Aspen. He is draining your bank accounts right at this exact moment. Enjoy being broke. I did not wait for the screaming to start. I did not wait for the questions or the tears. I simply turned around, took my husband's hand, and walked straight toward the front door. We stepped out into the freezing December snow, leaving the heavy oak door wide open behind us. I did not look back at the absolute chaos and devastation erupting inside the golden cage. The immediate aftermath of that Christmas Eve party was the quietest, most peaceful period of my entire life. The very next morning, I woke up in our apartment, made a pot of coffee, and methodically went through my phone. I blocked my mother's number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Monica, Julian, and every single extended relative who had stood by and watched them abuse me. I blocked their emails, their social media accounts, and even set up a filter to send any unknown numbers straight to voicemail. I severed the toxic roots entirely. The next 6 months felt like breathing pure oxygen after drowning for 32 years. Without the constant, crushing weight of my family's judgment dragging me down, my life absolutely skyrocketed. My career at the advertising agency flourished. Without the emotional exhaustion from my mother's phone calls, I had the energy to take on bigger, more aggressive campaigns. By the end of the spring, the agency promoted me to full partner. I had my name on the door and a salary that completely secured our future. Mason thrived just as much. He used his savings to leave his boss and open his very own independent auto repair shop. Because he was incredibly skilled, honest, and refused to overcharge his customers, word of mouth spread like wildfire. Within 4 months, his shop was so heavily booked that he had to hire 3 additional mechanics just to keep up with the demand. The man my family called a peasant was now running one of the most successful small businesses in the county. We pooled our money together and bought a beautiful, cozy house just 20 minutes outside the city limits. It did not have marble columns or a country club membership, but it had a massive garage for Mason, a huge backyard with old oak trees, and a kitchen filled with natural light. Our evenings were spent cooking dinner together, drinking cheap wine on the porch, and laughing at terrible movies. Our house was filled with genuine love and total peace. The ghost of my family's expectations was completely gone. I never checked up on them. I never looked them up online. I truly believed I would never hear about them ever again. But reality has a funny way of catching up to people who build their lives on lies. I found out about the catastrophic fallout entirely by accident. It was late autumn, almost a full year after the Christmas party. I was grabbing a quick lunch at a cafe downtown when I heard someone call my name. I turned around and saw Irene. Irene was one of my mother's oldest and closest country club friends. She looked much older than I remembered, and her face was heavy with pity. I almost walked out, but she gently grabbed my arm and begged me to sit down just for 5 minutes. She told me I needed to know what had happened. Irene ordered a tea, took a deep breath, and recounted the spectacular, devastating downfall of my family. The morning after I dropped that folder on the dining table, total panic set in. Julian told Monica he was going to his office to get the financial records to prove I was lying. Instead, he drove straight to the airport, boarded an international flight, and completely vanished. He took every single penny he could extract from the business accounts. The financial ruin hit them like an earthquake. Monica was entirely wiped out. Her life savings, her retirement accounts, the cash she had given him for the imaginary Aspen house, it was all gone. But it got worse. Because Monica had actively recruited several of her wealthy friends and colleagues into the investment fund, the federal authorities got involved. She was investigated by the IRS and faced massive civil lawsuits from the people who had lost their money. To save their golden child from going to federal prison and declaring total bankruptcy, my parents sacrificed everything. Sylvia and Gregory completely drained their retirement funds. They cashed out their life insurance policies. They took out a massive second mortgage on the beautiful suburban house, but the debts were just too high. Eventually, the bank foreclosed. The pristine house with the manicured lawn and the sweeping driveway was sold at auction. The social ruin was just as absolute. The country club quietly revoked their membership. The wealthy neighbors who had attended their parties completely cut them off, terrified of being associated with a federal fraud scandal. My parents and Monica were forced to move out of the suburbs entirely. Irene told me, in a hushed whisper, that they were now renting a cramped, run-down, two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the edge of the city. Their arrogance, their snobbery, and their desperate need to look wealthy had cost them absolutely everything. They were completely broke, socially exiled, and drowning in debt. I listened to Irene's story, thanked her for the tea, and walked back to my office. I expected to feel a surge of triumphant joy, but I did not. I just felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I did not celebrate their ruin, but I did not feel a single ounce of pity either. It was simply the inevitable consequence of their own toxic choices. 2 weeks later, on a freezing, rainy Tuesday evening in November, the past finally caught up to me. Mason and I were sitting in our warm living room, watching the fire crackle, when the doorbell rang. It was almost 9 at night. Mason frowned, muted the television, and walked with me to the front entryway. I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole. My heart skipped a beat. Standing on my front porch, soaking wet from the cold rain, were Sylvia, Gregory, and Monica. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open, leaving the chain engaged. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. They looked aged, exhausted, and broken. They were wearing cheap, worn-out coats. The immense arrogance that used to radiate from them was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, pathetic panic. When my mother saw me, she immediately started sobbing. It was not her usual manipulative crying, it was the ugly, terrifying cry of a woman who had hit rock bottom. She grabbed the edge of the door frame and begged for forgiveness. She called me her precious daughter. She told me how much they had missed me. Then, the real reason for the visit came tumbling out. She asked if they could move into our guest room just for a few months, just until they could get back on their feet. She begged me for a personal loan to help cover their rent. Monica stared at the wet porch boards, completely humiliated, unable to even look me in the eye. My father just stood in the back, mumbling a weak apology into his collar. I looked at the 3 people who had tortured me for 3 decades. The people who had called my husband a peasant, threw away my achievements, and told me I was dead to them. I searched my heart for even a tiny shred of familial obligation, but there was nothing left. They had burned the bridge, and now they wanted me to save them from the fire they started. I looked directly into my mother's pleading eyes. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of emotion. "The daughter you are looking for died at your Christmas party," I said. "You made your choice years ago. I am just living with mine." I gently, but firmly, pushed the heavy oak door shut until I heard the latch click. I slid the deadbolt into place. I turned around, walked back into the living room, sat down next to my husband by the warm fire, and finally breathed freely. I built a beautiful life from the ground up with the man they told me was beneath us, while their greed and arrogance cost them everything. Closing that door on them was the hardest, yet most liberating thing I've ever done. But some relatives are blowing up my phone, calling me cruel for not helping my own flesh and blood when they are homeless. So, tell me, am I wrong for walking away and letting them drown in the mess they created? Should I have given them another chance? Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to me, and it helps bring more stories like this to light. See you in the next video.